Hey there, Margie Bryce here, bringing you the Crabby Pastor podcast. And I don't think you're going to be too surprised to know that it's too easy today to become the Crabby Pastor. Our time together will give you food for thought to help you be the ministry leader fully surrendered to God's purposes and living into whatever it takes to get you there and keep you there. So we're talking about sustainability in ministry. Join me for these next two episodes where I am going to be interviewing Reverend Alex Lang. And he was sort of made famous, if you will, on the internet by an article he wrote. And I know I picked that up on my Facebook group, Sustainability for Ministry Leaders. It was called Why I Left the Church, and it went rabid around everywhere. So Alex agreed to come on and chat because as I read through that, there was the usual sort of stuff that pastors carp about when we get together. But towards the end, there was some commentary about, and a contributing factor to why he left, the growth mindset versus the closed mindset. And that's what we're going to explore for this episode and the next one. And I want to kind of give you a heads up. This is like a 3,000 mile view downward upon the church and how we lead the church. And the other piece of it is that as a pastor, it doesn't take long for you to sense that where you want to go and the places you'd like to take this congregation to experience God in deeper ways is not where they quite often want to go themselves. And they seem rather entrenched in wanting to do things the way they've always been done around here and on and on and on. Or some have even been quite so blatant, and I've heard this said by a congregant, just keep things going the way it is until I die, and after that, who cares? So, this is a challenge for us as ministry leaders because we go into ministry to serve the purposes of Jesus, to help people understand what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And as some of my readings have, continue to affirm, and I'm sure they do for you too, that a church is to be a disciple-making factory where we are chronically trying to help people understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus out there in the wide and crazy world. So I wanted to give you a bit of a heads up about where we're going because this is some big picture thinking that Alex and I got into great conversation, so much so that it's going to be this episode and the next one. So join us. Well, you will be glad that you tuned in to this episode of The Crabby Pastor, and I'm your host, Margie Bryce, and I am here with Reverend Alex Lang. Now, maybe you know that name. Maybe you don't. I have no frame of reference for that, but he was the author of an article that just went viral called Departure, Why I Left the Church, and he left First Presbyterian of Arlington Heights and wrote a whole treatise about, from his perspective, why he left. And we're really not going to talk about that exactly. We're going to talk about a component of that I thought was really fascinating. But Alex, I'm going to let you just kind of introduce yourself in any way you'd like.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate you inviting me to be part of your podcast. And I've served in the church for about 20 years. I started when I was 23 working in the church, and I've served 14 of those years in ordained capacities. So I was 4 years as an associate pastor in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And then the last 10 years of that was here in Arlington Heights as the head of staff at First Pres.
Where's Arlington Heights? Is it?
It's a suburb of Chicago. So
Okay.
it's the
Okay.
northwest suburbs.
I wasn't
And
sure if it was that or Virginia. I don't know why, but I
yeah,
didn't look it
well,
up.
I grew up in Virginia actually. So
Oh, did you?
yeah, in the
Oh,
town of
that's fun.
Fredericksburg. That's where I'm
Oh,
from. That it's a Civil War town. So and
yeah.
my family went to the Presbyterian Church of Fredericksburg, which I always joke, they didn't call, most places it's like first pres, second pres, whatever, right? Like
Yeah.
they called themselves the Presbyterian Church of Fredericksburg, as if there would never be another in town.
I'm from predominantly raised in Southern Maryland. So
Oh
I get
wow.
this. I get the Civil War thing totally. We are like 20 minutes to Washington D.C. I would be a great tour guide to Washington D.C. because of all the times I toured down there as a student in middle school and high school and even elementary. So, but what I wanted to just quickly ask you is the article and how much traction it got. How many views did you finally see that the it was getting when it went viral?
Yeah, so when I set it out, the first day it ended up getting like 8,000 views, which I thought was remarkable because most of the time my article gets about 70 reads. So that
I'd be
was
happy with that number. Yeah.
yeah. So I was like, 8,000, this is crazy. And then it popped up the next day. It went to over 100,000. And by Labor Day weekend, it had gone over 200,000. It now sits at 390,000. So it's definitely tapered off quite a bit since that kind of first week that it went viral. But it was definitely a surreal experience to see something that you wrote, which really I assumed nobody would read, to then spread in the way that it did. It was quite unexpected.
Yeah, yeah, I picked it up in my self-care and sustainability Facebook group because I of course was fascinated with that because I'm concerned about self-care in the lives of ministry leaders and building sustainability and leadership issues because you have to lead yourself well first to be a leader. So I trolled through it and there was the usual suspects, sort of, the unrealistic expectations, the unseen damage. You covered all that. But when I got down to the growth mindset versus fixed mindset, I thought, oh my goodness, I have lived that. And that to me was one of the heartbreakers. You go into ministry to serve the purposes of Jesus. And finding that it was a challenge to get the people to buy into that idea was, cognitive dissonance. And I looked it up. It's living with, I think we're doing this, they think we're doing that. And I have to live in that tension. And that sounds really lovely. I'm going to live in the tension, but it's not. It's hard. It's very difficult. So I was wondering if you could walk us through some of that. So we're going to talk about the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. And why don't you start by giving us some kind of description of the fixed mindset?
Yeah, so a fixed mindset is people who don't like to be challenged. So they perceive failure to kind of be the limits of their ability. And they tend to be scared of learning new things, particularly if that education, if it disrupts their worldview. And I don't know about your experience, but my experience, I actually think this is a lot of people in the institutional church. They don't want their thinking challenged. They come to church to reinforce what they've always believed. And so I think that the job of the pastor from their perspective is not really to push them to grow, but to kind of reassure them that they're on the right track. And so something that I said in the article was that I think that what this means is that if you're going to learn something, it should support the party line. It should comfort their investment of resources in the church. And in particular, they want to know that whatever they're investing is going to pay off down the line somewhere, usually in terms of afterlife. Now, in my church,
Oh my
I
goodness.
was,
You know what
yeah,
I'm thinking
sorry,
of
yeah.
when you're saying that?
No, what do you
I'm
say? What are you
sorry.
thinking? Go ahead.
I hated to interrupt, but I was thinking
No, go
about
ahead.
how all those beautiful cathedrals were built in Europe because people were making an investment hoping that their loved ones would get out of purgatory or some kind of sin, some kind of those payments. I think
Yeah,
as
the
beautiful as they are,
indulgences.
the
Yes.
indulgences. I,
Yeah, no,
oh,
absolutely. Well, I mean, and that continues on forward, where I think that when you think about why people give, I mean, I think oftentimes it's to support the community, but somewhere behind there for I think a number of people is this idea that, well, if I'm giving to the church, that shows my investment in the kingdom. And hopefully, even though there's this idea that we are, shown grace and forgiveness and that nothing can earn our way in, Luther, right? Nothing
right,
you can do to
right.
earn your way, earn salvation, which comes from Paul. So that I think that you do that to think, well, I'm giving and therefore there will be some type of reward later on that comes with that. So anyways, yeah, I totally see where you're coming with that.
You were
And
talking about failure though in there, because I think there is some fear of failure. And so if they've failed at something, you'll hear this kind of thing in a meeting. Well, we already tried that, or we already did that. And if something didn't go as well as they want, and I said, well, if you're not failing at stuff regularly, it means you're not trying anything new.
yeah, no, definitely. And failure is or a fear of failure is a big part of a fixed mindset mentality. And I think that, I actually want to take some time a little later on to jump into that, because I think that there's a lot built into why a person kind of dives into a fixed mindset or why they have a fixed mindset. I was thinking it's an interesting question because I was saying, a lot of people in the church have fixed mindsets. And I don't know about you and your ministry, but for me, I always push the boundaries. And
Mm-hmm.
I particularly push the boundaries for me. I did it in the way that I push their thinking. So I did so before I like push them to do things, I would push their thinking around things. So for me, though, I believe in a growth mindset. And in a growth mindset, what that means is I'm going to pose questions. I'm going to give you information. I'm going to let you determine the answer. And I made it clear from the beginning, I don't expect you to think the way that I do. You do not have to believe the things that I believe. And at the same time, right, I don't have to believe the things you believe. And what I expect is that we, with this information, we grow together, we make our own assessments, and we walk together in this way. Because to me, where we're kind of getting at is I want you to live Jesus's life. I want you to live the things that he does, as opposed to what is traditionally the common narrative in Christianity, which is, well, Jesus died for me, therefore I'm forgiven. And if I do anything good, that's gravy on the side. I don't have to really do anything else. Whereas for me to be a disciple, you have to live it. And so by kind of disrupting those narratives, it makes you have to think about, okay, am do I really care about living this, or do I really just care about the end result, which is the heaven thing that I
Mm-hmm.
really want to get to? So that's why I would do it. I didn't just do it because I wanted to mess up their world. I wanted to do
Right,
it so that
right.
they would live it out, if that makes
I
sense.
mean, that is kind of heavy to wrap your mind around for a minute as I'm even listening to you. But then what also has come to mind is what Oswald Chambers says is, are you attached to your ideas about Jesus, or are you attached to Jesus?
Yes,
And
I
and
agree with that.
and then I think too, some of, younger generation, I'm thinking of, people that I know in their 30s and have looked at, they say, you don't really believe this and this and this. And you sit there and you say, well, yes, I do believe that. But right now, and in some places, the evidence is kind of thin about, you say you believe it, but then where's the evidence? Like they used to say, if is there enough evidence to convict you of being a disciple of Jesus? I don't know. Maybe not. But maybe we need to think more broadly about some things. And then, like you said, it has an impact on you evaluate your own faith and say, okay, am I a follower of Jesus? Like, am I living that lifestyle? Or am I, get saved and sit down and say, hey, I'm good to go. And it's okay if you're crabby or or whatever.
Well, yeah, well, and it's interesting you're bringing up the fact of younger people. So, I'm 43, and what I know is that many people of my generation and younger do question the narrative. A lot of them, if you go
Mm-hmm.
around and you ask them, do you believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus, younger people? A lot of them will just say no. Like, why would I? There's no scientific reality to it because we were steeped in science growing up, which is a very different kind of, I mean, I'll just give you an example. I think this is kind of fascinating, right? So I was born in 1979. In 1984 is when that theory about the dinosaurs being destroyed by an asteroid that's when that was put out. So
Mm-hmm.
I grew up my entire life knowing that that likely was how dinosaurs were destroyed. Now, actually, today they're actually upending that narrative. And they're saying, well, if you look at the record, that's actually probably a lot of them were already dead by the time they came. Irrespective, the point being, I grew up with science as part of my life. Whereas a lot of people who I'm ministering to in my congregation, that theory, they didn't grow up with that. They didn't. I remember I preached about that one time. A lot of them didn't even know that was the case, that dinosaurs had been destroyed by an asteroid. They were unaware of that because they had never learned it in school and they guess they had missed it somewhere along the
Mm-hmm.
way. And so I point that out to say, like, the restorative faith thing, like my whole thing, the book that I wrote is designed for people my age or anybody really who questions, to say, like, hey, there's another way to approach this. Because for a lot of people, if you sit there and you say, for example, you have to believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus to be a Christian. Well, they're done. They're out. You've just basically canceled them out because they are going to struggle to believe in that, the virgin birth, a lot of the things that we kind of fundamentally say you have to believe these to be a Christian. I go through and I say, actually, I have a way that you can believe in Christianity, still be a follower of Jesus, and yet you can still have the science that you believe in, and it's okay. And there's a lot, I spend a lot of time in the book talking about that, but you're bringing up a really important point, which is that for younger individuals and for a lot of people, I think that we talk about this hypocrisy, right? Of people say, I'm going to, like, I don't want to go to church because those people don't really act the way they're supposed to act. And you've kind of, by saying what you've said a little bit earlier, you stumbled onto, I think the reason why that happens is because of the fact that people often in the church just say, well, I'm good to go and I can rest on my laurels and not have to really worry about anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, they'll say, faith alone,
Yes, that's all I need.
or scripture alone, faith alone, however they want to phrase that. And I didn't even disclose this earlier when we were just kind of chatting beforehand, but I was raised Catholic.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, yes, let's, add a little, and then came to Christ while reading scripture at my dining room table, going, oh my gosh, this is real. This is real. And then you encounter the construct of many churches. At the time, my first exploration was Bible study, and I went to Bible study for like a year and a half, and then I went to the church, and then you have to buy into their construct or you're out. And there are many people not a ton, that I encountered along my journey that would say, oh, you went to seminary, and they would refer to it as cemetery because that's where your faith goes to die. And then you're going to come out with all of these new ideas, new thoughts. I mean, if I say I had a discussion with somebody who we talked about the creation narratives. And I said, I think that the most important component of that is God created, God created, God created. There's a repeated phrase in there that I think if the Spirit of God is enlivening someone to capture this, there's a reason. So what had happened is there were many narratives about creation. I learned that at cemetery or seminary, wherever. And they were ancient writings that captured this. But what the writer was doing was ascribing creation to God. And I don't know, I said, God could probably do it in 7 days. I'm good with that. And if it didn't happen, okay, well, this person said, well, if it's not 7 literal days, my whole Bible is incorrect. And I'm thinking, but that's 66 books by I don't know how you can say the whole Bible's, down the toilet because of that. And I just felt like, we have difficulty taking a 3,000-foot view about some things. And at the same time, I've worked revitalization process enough where you sit down with church leaders and say, why do you go to this church? And they say, oh, well, my grandfather came here and then my dad. And then so now we are. And, and by the end of it, my colleagues, when we met afterwards, I said, oh my gosh, my head is going to explode if somebody doesn't say Jesus really soon. It just, and so you're working a process of helping them to recapture the essence of what we're supposed to be about, which is making disciples and following Jesus. And what have we done here? We've created many institutions that just want to have their numbers and meet their budget goals and continue. And I'm not saying nobody's doing anything good in the midst of all that. It certainly is. But where are our people's mindset? I mean, you talk about a broad definition of sin. That's a self-centered mindset. So mindset is it's important. It really is important in that. And so what you did, you kind of rocked my world a little bit because I'm following what you're saying and going, okay, that might have happened because I'm reading in Luke. And I'm sitting there saying, you read Zechariah's song, you read Mary's song, and I say to myself, how did Luke capture that? Because he wrote it so far after Jesus, and who remembered this word for word and put that there, and you have to start thinking about some things like that. But at the same token, do you or do you not think that Jesus can handle those kinds of questions?
Yeah, well, if your faith can't handle questions and doubt, that's not faith. And I think a lot of people have replaced faith with certainty. So, faith is believing in things unknown. And I think that what they say is, well, okay, and it's kind of funny, just given what I talked about with the whole scientific thing, of the crucifixion. Some people might be sitting there saying, well, you certainly don't do that with with the story. And I think that it's very interesting. A faith should be able to handle doubt. If you can't handle doubt, if you can't handle questions, then that faith is not built on anything that's very strong. And so for me, whenever my faith got kind of rocked, which would happen, like it still happens to this day,
Mm-hmm.
the question I come back to is, okay, how do I rebuild it? That's growth mindset. Like that's the growth mindset. The growth mindset is the person who says, okay, you just fed me a piece of information that totally upends kind of most of my thinking. How am I going to incorporate that? Not reject it, but how am I going to incorporate that into my thinking in such a way that I can now maintain the things that I feel are important? How do I have integrity to who I am, but yet I allow that to be part of who I am too? Whereas I think a fixed mindset, again, will just reject and say, well, I'm just not going to, I don't want to even hear that piece of information because it's too hard for me. It challenges me too much. And so I often came back to the people in my church who were very against me and the things that I was saying. I would say, look, I was like, you don't have to believe what I'm saying word for word, but you do have to consider it. You have to consider what it means to you. And I think that's critical thinking, which unfortunately I feel like in our world today is becoming less and less viable among people. People are not critical thinkers in the same way, but that's a growth mindset mentality.
Would you say then that this is a component or a facet of the deconstruction that many people are talking about? And I'm not real well versed on that, except I keep seeing it everywhere.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question about deconstruction. I'm a huge deconstructionist, as you might be able to tell just from the little
Mm-hmm.
conversation we've had. I deconstruct everything. And I think that to me, what that does is it brings you, it gets you, it basically, it tears away all of the details that frankly can confuse people and it gets you to the core of what matters. What really, at the end of the day, matters about Christianity. And so for me, if you were to ask me that question, it's Jesus's message, Jesus's teachings. Those things to me, they change the world. across the board. And I can point to example after example after example of how those who live into Jesus's teachings and the things that he says, the sacrifice, the willingness to give of yourself, the willingness to die to self, the willingness to love your enemy and to turn the other cheek, all of those things change the world. And they always have, and they always will. And so if you live into those things, and I think to do that, you ultimately have to have not just because you can sit there and you can say, well, then why, if it's just, is it just a philosophy? And I would say, on the one hand, yes. But on the other hand, you can't really do those things unless you understand unconditional love. And that is what comes from God. That's the place where you need to have faith. So for me, my faith is actually very simple. I strip away all those things,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, I think the problem is that the institutional church has been built around a lot of those the traditions and the details, the dogma. Those are things are very, very important to many, many people. And I think that the deconstruction that's happening as the church kind of is collapsing right now, and it's collapsing for a lot of different reasons. But as it collapses, what I see happening is that for those who really want to connect, they're going to connect through you be having integrity. Like the people who would come to me who were younger, they would often say, you know what I like about what you talk about? It's that I can just live it and I don't have to think about all the other stuff that frankly causes me to want to walk away. And so if you can get a whole community of people walking together in lockstep and living out the teaching of Jesus, I think that is going to create communities where you're going to see forward movement as opposed to what's happening right now, which is a lot of the communities that are caught in the dogma tend to be collapsing in on themselves.
Yeah, and we are to be making disciples of Jesus, people who follow what Jesus said, what Jesus did, and becoming more and more Christ-like. And then I would dovetail where you talk about the energizing peace being God's unconditional love, and that we really can't live that out. There is a spiritual component, the power of the Spirit that enables people to live into that, because if left to our own devices, we just aren't so swift at that.
Yeah, try to love your enemy without
Mm-hmm.
unconditional love. That's not going to happen. And most people, you could if you have children, you probably understand some level of unconditional love.
Mm-hmm.
But even that can have conditions on it, depending on kind of what happens in your family.
Mm-hmm.
I think that all parents would like to believe that they have true unconditional love for their children, but at the same time, that can be tested. And so I think the one place in my life where I've experienced unconditional love is from God. And so that's why I can say I understand the concept of loving your enemy. And absent that, that would just be some type of intellectual exercise. I don't think I could actually do it. So to me, there is a very serious connection between having that encounter with a God of unconditional love and being able to live those teachings of Jesus. Those two things are integrally connected to each other. And if you don't have it, it can't occur. In my opinion, it's
Yeah,
you're going to struggle to make those
sure.
things happen.
Sure. I had some kind of early on in my faith, another discussion with somebody where I said to them, and I was raised Catholic, and then I started attending this one church, and I'm in a Sunday school class, and they were discussing whether one whole section of Christianity was going to hell. And I got deeply disturbed by that. And I said, what if you don't know to say the words, well, I'm saved. I've accepted Jesus as my personal savior. What if you don't know to say that, but you have a very vibrant walk with God, and there's a spiritual element enlivened by the Holy Spirit? And, what if you don't know to say that? And they said, oh, well, you can't be saved unless you say, I am saved. And I'm like, well, I think God's bigger than that. I mean, do this is like a Monty Python picture where, God says, are you saved? And someone says, well, I really didn't ever, boom. And then you go flying off into the abyss or something, and I thought, sometimes I think people behave and function as if their God is too small.
Oh, I agree with that completely. And I think that, if we're going to talk a little bit more about the fixed versus growth mindset,
Yep.
I think that I think that if you have a big God, that's usually a sign of a growth mindset.
Are you wondering whether your fatigue, your lack of motivation, your lack of interest is burnout, maybe? I just wanted to let you know that I have a resource on the website, margiebryce.com. That's BRYCE, margiebryce.com. And it is a burnout questionnaire free for you to download and kind of self-assess and get a sense of where you're at. And there are questions that not only ask about what you're going through, but maybe how often you're experiencing it. And that's kind of a key to where you might be, because you have to know where you are in order to chart a course forward. And most pastors and ministry leaders who experience burnout rarely know that that's where they're at until they're well into it. And if you're unsure about that little statistic, so far everybody that I've interviewed on this podcast who has experienced burnout, when I ask that kind of question, they're like, yeah, I didn't know that's where I was at. So again, go to margiebryce.com. It's on the homepage of the website, and you can get your burnout questionnaire and kind of see where you're at. Hey friends, the Crabby Pastor podcast is sponsored by Bryce Art Glass, and you can find that on Facebook. I make stained glass, that's part of my self-care. And also by Bryce Coaching, where I coach ministry leaders and business leaders. And so the funds that I generate from coaching and from making stained glass is what is supporting this podcast. And I will have opportunities for you to be a part of sponsoring me. And as always, you can do the buy me a cup of coffee thing in the show notes. But I will have some other ways that you can be a part of getting the word out about the importance of healthy self-care for ministry leaders. Hey, thanks for listening. It is my deep desire and passion to champion issues of sustainability in ministry and for your life. So I'm here to help. I stepped back from pastoral ministry, and I feel called to help ministry leaders create and cultivate sustainability in their lives so that they can go the distance with God and whatever plans that God has for you. I would love to help. I would consider it an honor. And in all things, make sure you connect to these sustainability practices, so that you don't become the crabby pastor.